Talk a little bit about childhood poverty. For those of us who have lived here a long time and have raised our kids together, and that is most of us, and I think we recognize that Claremont has historically had one of New Hampshire's highest levels of childhood poverty. 30 years ago, we had the second highest level of childhood poverty. In the 30 years that have gone by, we have had two major economic upswings in this country, two large, long-lasting upswings. This community has spent millions, if not tens of millions of dollars on economic development. 30 years later, we have the second highest level of childhood poverty in the state. I suggest to you that there's a connection between the two. If 20% of our children are living in childhood poverty, if 20% of our children between the ages of 0 and 3 don't have appropriate health care, don't have a parent who reads to them on a daily basis, don't have food that is adequate for their nutrition, and don't have the care that they need, they end up going to school at 4 or 5 totally unprepared. And then we expect the school to miraculously turn that around, and it cannot do it. So what we end up with, if you look at those children on that video, they are going to be the parents of the next homeless generation. And I guarantee that 30 years from now, if we keep this course, Claremont will still have one of the highest childhood poverty rates in the state. Back in the mid-'80s, when the companies that fueled our economy, the Tam Brands and the Foundry and Sullivan Machine and Cone Blanchard over in Windsor, they were really pumping out lots of product and employing lots of people. And we still have the second highest childhood poverty rate in the state. So unless we find a way as a community to actually acknowledge that it exists, and understand that absent changing that, we will not grow as a community. And it is clear to me, and most of you, well, those of you who have lived here for a long time, know I was involved with the city for many, many years. I saw the efforts that were made to attract business. I saw the efforts that were made to try and give new companies a start, and yet I cannot remember once at a council meeting, not once, anyone saying, and Mr. Manager, I'm sorry to say this, where are you? There you are, Ryan. I don't remember any councilman or council person ever saying, Mr. Manager, tell me what the childhood poverty rate is. And 6 months later saying, what progress have we made? Or 2 years later saying, what have we done? It just has never occurred. And yet, it has, from our downtown, it has expanded to consume a larger and larger portion of what we see on a daily basis. And what we see on a daily basis is kids who struggle. And sadly, by the time they get into my court, that means that the state has brought an abuse and neglect petition. And that means that there's a strong likelihood that the child is going to be removed from the house. There are many ways that we create homelessness, and Corey and I will talk a little bit about that, but I really, I accept a large portion of the blame for not recognizing the significance and the seriousness of little kids who don't have enough to eat. Kids who have never had anyone read a book to them. And it takes its toll. It is a dehumanizing thing, as those little kids said, to grow up knowing when you go to school you've got to be one of the kids that gets a backpack because no one can provide you with a backpack. We measure job growth. We measure, you can go online and measure wages. You can go online and see what our taxes are and how much aid we get from the state and from the federal government. but it is really difficult to see on the ground the impact that kids from 0 to 3 not having an appropriate home, the impact that that has on all of us as a society. We're not alone, and I don't mean to say that we're alone, because it is sadly the bane of the existence of old mill towns in many, many ways. And we have a tendency, and I was guilty of this too. A lot of times we blame the poor people. We blame poor people for being poor. And blaming poor people for their own poverty doesn't get us anywhere. We're not better than they are. Any one of us could have ended up in a situation where you're in front of me losing your home or losing your apartment. And I cringe when I know that I have to sign an eviction for a young mother who is going to be homeless with 3 young children. So I want to concentrate on the kids. I really think that that's the important part. Forget about saying, well, why can't the parents do this? Or why isn't dad doing that? You have to concentrate on the kids. And one way of doing that, and there are plenty, but one way of doing that is something that TLC has been doing for a long time on a very small basis that I think expanded into the home of every poor or every mother-to-be who is under the poverty line, every young family that is under the poverty line, and that is to have someone in that house on a regular basis making sure that mom's health as she's pregnant is addressed, that the children's health on an ongoing basis is addressed, that they have books to read and somebody to read to them. This is stuff that they do too. I'm pointing at TLC. With families in my court, when I'm able to get TLC involved, and this is graduation season. I was invited to a half-dozen graduations, both high school and college, from kids that were homeless, were born into abject poverty, that they worked with and some other programs worked with, that had their lives turned around. So it's possible. But if it's possible for a small portion, it's possible for a larger group. And if we can make a change for that larger group, believe me, 10 years from now, and 20 years from now, we're not going to be sitting around talking about the impact homelessness has on the schools and the impact that childhood poverty has on all of us. I sent some information out several months ago to many of you. It was a Washington Post article that described a program that is in place in many areas, but this particular one in Appalachia, the poorest area in Appalachia, called A Nurse in Every Home. And that community, within a generation, has managed to make huge strides. So it can be done. I just want to ask you, because I know all of you deal with this in your own way, and I also know that all of you are committed to this community and have been committed to this community for so long. As I look around, I've known many of you for a long time, decades, and you're still here and you're still fighting, and I know your commitment. So respectfully, really respectfully, I ask you to consider getting on your agenda on a regular basis childhood poverty and a report on childhood poverty. And I really do think if you figure that out, if we can figure that out, and I'm not asking for money, I am just here asking you to recognize what I now recognize to be such a difficult and long-lasting problem in this community. And just like you get your economic reports, see if we can make a difference in some way. So that's my short presentation. Thanks for having me. I really do appreciate being here.
Tonight, new evidence of the severity of the opioid epidemic.
A woman is being charged tonight after allegedly overdosing while 7 months pregnant. Authorities say the situation was so dire they were forced to deliver the baby early.
The mother survived, but now she's facing a list of charges, and she's not the only one. John Shumway joins us with the rest of the details. John.
Yeah, as you hear more and more about this, it is just incredible. The woman we're talking about had literally gotten out on parole from jail 5 days before this incident happened. Tonight, she is in McGee Women's Hospital behind me. So is the baby. She is expected to be fine. There are questions tonight whether the baby will survive. To this East Butler apartment building, police were called just after midnight Friday morning. The report, a woman unresponsive, an apparent overdose.
We've been getting a ton of, but not necessarily in the realms of 7 months pregnant.
Inside apartment 6, 30-year-old Casey Dishman was on the bathroom floor. Her boyfriend, 36-year-old Andrew Lucas, telling medics she had a seizure disorder. The medics were not told there was heroin involved.
If they would have known right away, they probably could have administered Narcan and maybe prevented, the remnants of this.
Police say so even when she arrived at Butler Memorial's ER, Dishman was still not being treated for an overdose.
She went into cardiac arrest and they resuscitated her.
As Dishman was transferred to Mercy Hospital unconscious and on a respirator, police with a search warrant found the needle hidden in the bathroom of the apartment. At Mercy, she was stabilized and on Saturday moved to McGee for an emergency C-section.
Baby's not doing good at all. She's was resuscitated, I believe, once, and she's on a life support system now.
And doctors have indicated there is no brain activity. Today, Casey Dishman was charged with felony aggravated assault on an unborn child.
Should the baby not survive, then we've consulted with the district attorney's office, and he's leaning towards filing the criminal homicide charge.
And charges could also be filed against Andrew Lucas, the father of the baby who was involved in this situation. Especially if the child dies, he could face charges in that respect as well. He is in the Mercer County Prison tonight. Casey Dishman will be transferred to a prison medical facility as soon as she is able to leave the hospital behind me, and that could come as early as tomorrow. Live in Oakland, John Shumway, KDKA TV News.
Ms. LeClaire.
So I wanted to share some data with you, because I think I have the school perspective on this, but I think that from the city side, it's relevant as well. I don't know if you caught in the film, but the New Hampshire housing wage is $43,865. And if I understand that number correctly, and I may be off, but that's essentially the income that is the average income required for a typical 2-bedroom apartment. A teacher in the Claremont School District for 16-17 contract year would have to be on step 9 in order to make more than $43,865. Step 9 is $43,932. And I know that there are wage concerns with the police force as well and what their wages look like. And so when we're thinking about budgets and things of that nature, that's where the school board and the city council can come to the table and thinking about what that New Hampshire housing wage is and how do we address poverty from that perspective. When we think about the free and reduced lunch rates in our community, our district-wide rate tends to average around 50%. Bluff Elementary, 70%. This is from March. That's the most recent data I have. Claremont Middle School, 49%. Disnard, 59%. Maple, 54%. Stevens High School, 40%. If we look at Stevens High School at 40%, and we know that we have Bluff Elementary School at 70%, people don't just randomly become less impoverished as the kids get older. We just have an issue where once kids get into middle school and the high school, the stigma becomes more of a reality and they don't fill out the paperwork. They don't want to be identified in any way as being recognized as in poverty, so the rates decline. I'm optimistic that with the school board's adoption of a new food service vendor last night, not as much of the vendor, but the fact that we will have a point of sale system in place that allows for greater anonymity for our students, that we will have a greater chance to have those students who need that support get that support without any sort of stigma attached to it. When we think about this year's 2016-17's number of students who are identified as homeless, we're at 156. We have about 1,753 students in our school district, and 156 of them were identified as homeless. This number is lower than last year and years past. This number is lower primarily because in December of 2016, December 10th to be exact, the McKinney-Vento law changed. So formally, students who are awaiting foster care were identified as homeless because they are in transition. They're lacking fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence. If they are to the level where they are awaiting foster care, it's because Jack has seen them, Judge Yazinski has seen them, and they are looking for a placement that is more appropriate than the placement in which they were living. So those students are no longer identified in that number. It's a different categorization, it's a different categorical heading for those students now, so they're not included, and we were still at 156 kids. Yes.
Beyond that, and this statistic may include a portion of that, but at any given time it's primarily Claremont when I talk about Sullivan County, but we have about 140 guardianships established at any given time. And that means that somewhere between 150 and 250 children, young children, are being raised by someone who's not their parent. And it is usually a grandparent who can't afford to raise the children, or an aunt or an uncle. So that statistic gets skewed a little bit because those kids, while they have a place to live, they are not living with a parent, and they are living a Spartan lifestyle. And if you looked at the numbers of guardianships, of course they have risen substantially because of the opioid crisis, and it's going to continue to rise. But those kids often end up going to a district that's maybe outside of this district, so they're changing schools mid-year, or they're changing the local schools, though I know that our school system really does go out of their way to make sure that there's some kind of continuity in a child's life. But the thought that this community of 13,000 people could have several hundred children living in an out-of-home placement is frightening to me.
We've had more parental deaths this year than we've had in the past. Judge Yazinski mentioned the opioid epidemic, and that is definitely having an impact on the schools. Some data that's not tracked in any clean form, so we don't have it yet. We try to wrap it up after July 1st, are the number of students that we have who have dealt with at least one or more of their parents or guardians being incarcerated. Last year's calculation was around 10% of our population in our schools who have had one or more parents incarcerated. The number of students removed from their home, so this is something that's a challenge to track, because when we have kin care, kids placed with folks who are not necessarily their legal parent or guardian, but they are still with a family member, that doesn't always come through to us as a data point. So it's challenging for us to track. Or those who are in foster care, because we had a mid-year transition with that legal categorization, that's a challenge for us to track as well. So those types of data points, there's no systematic process for tracking that across our district or the state. So it's much more, you have to sort of go by hand, go through all of our kids, try to figure out, based on other information points and other connections we have, who's categorized that way, just to help with a better understanding of what our kids are dealing. Same thing with the number of students sent to placement via the court. The schools, we have a great working relationship with the court and other agencies, but there's not always a clear communication channel so that everyone is on the same page. Often there's some confidentiality things that need to be upheld as well. And so if there is a student who's placed via the court, we don't always know that. And sometimes for very good reason, we don't know that. So those aren't things that we can always track cleanly. Those who have been placed in mental health facilities, I know we have had a number of our children this year be placed in mental health facilities for extended periods of time. But again, that's not something that we have historically tracked. It's something that we want to track and need to track because I think it helps paint a clearer picture for everyone, but we don't have this historical data on that.
Corey, can I ask you a question?
Yes.
Everybody knows this, but for my own satisfaction, and maybe Melanie or Maggie, you can jump in here. The number of children that end up needing an IEP or a separate plan that grow up or that were exposed to childhood poverty or domestic violence, those rates are really stunning and shocking, and it's something that you end up dealing with at your level when a child enters school. But that order, that map was already written long before you got them. So that I think that connection is so important to always keep in mind that if we're not reaching those children or the pregnant mothers and those children during that very formative, important period, then it's too late. It's too late.
Maggie's organization was able to show a film it might have even been like a month or two ago now, called Resilience, and it was really about the impact of trauma on the brain. And we talked about this a little bit last night at the school board meeting, in so much as the brain starts shedding around age 9. And so if there are neural pathways that haven't been activated by that point, or have maybe been activated at one point but aren't fostered and nourished along the way, the brain just starts shedding them. And there's all of these fight or flight reactions and responses in the brain. And so the brain that has experienced trauma, whether it be physical, mental, sexual abuse, whether it is, the mental health, drug abuse, parents who are divorced, that brain that has experienced trauma is literally wired differently than a brain that has not experienced trauma. One of the things that we are hoping to be able to do, working within the regulations around administering surveys, is to understand how many of our students, at least at the middle school and the high school, have experienced adverse childhood experiences, and what does that look like, and not to pinpoint specific children, but to get a better understanding of what is our student population in our schools that have experienced levels of trauma that really require us to respond differently for them to be successful. 50% of our 5th graders did not start with us. So when we talk about the kids in this film who have been moving around to multiple different schools, half of our 5th graders did not start with us. And so when we think about the education that we can provide them, it's fabulous. But half of them didn't start with us and haven't been privy to that education along the way. And all of these things are tied back to the idea, not all of them, thinking about research. There are obviously kids who have moved to us because of very positive reasons, families are relocated or things like that for work. But those who have not, those who have experienced trauma, those who have experienced homelessness, those who have experienced mental health issues and drug issues and things of that nature, that has a negative impact. When we look at our students, I did the data dive a couple of years ago now, so I haven't looked at it in the last year or two. Comparing our identified population, those with an IEP, an individualized education plan, also known as special education, that rate for our district runs about 25%. It's about double the state average. When I compared the number of those students who were also in the poverty cohort or subgroup, if you will, there was about a 17% overlap when you're looking at the time it was NECAP data, so those in grades 3 through 8. It's not as big of an overlap as you would expect it to be necessarily. So it just becomes another head of the multi-headed monster of what we're dealing with from the school's perspective. But I think what Judge Yazinski is alluding to and what Maggie and Melanie do in their work is, how can we target the kids before they're even born? How can we target those moms who are pregnant and help them get better prenatal care, better education about how to support their kids? How can we target our birth to 5 kids when we really have, I mean, I think it's 80%, Maggie, of the brain is formed by age 3. A really large percentage of the brain is formed by age 3. I believe it's 80 or 85%. So how do we support those kids in the 0 to 3 range to better position them for later in life, so you can break that generational poverty cycle? Because it is a cycle. We see the same families. Judge Yazinski has been doing this a long time. There's others of you in this room who have been doing this for a long time, whatever your work is, and you see now the grandchildren of the parents you saw many moons ago who are having similar issues, because it's a cyclical process. And so when we think about how do we change it for the future, and how do we shift that trajectory, we need to think about what are we doing with those kids, because that's where we have the greatest impact, and that's where we can have the greatest success. We are fortunate as a school district to be able to work with organizations like Turning Points Network and like TLC, and partnering on different initiatives. We have our One for All space, which is we have an early childhood fit coordinator. They are targeted at our homeless families 0 to 5, and we have seen tremendous success with that so far. But there's a lot more that we could be doing, I think, as a community, if we could come together as a community and talk about what we could collectively do. It's nice that we had the Green Dot presentation first and this presentation second, because now I can leverage what you learned there. Nobody in this room has to do anything miraculous. We all just have to do some small thing, our little part, to change the culture in our community around these issues and around how we can support our children, because our children are what are going to help us break these cycles and have us come out on the other side with a different outcome than what we've seen for the last 30, 40, 50 years.
And if I could just say one thing, when we talk about the children that we're discussing today, these children have horrific needs, but it's not just, we can't turn our back on them, because if we turn our back on them, we turn our back on all our children. Because in a public school setting, these children with their needs and our obligation to address those needs, they also have an effect on their classmates. And they are entitled to a least restrictive environment. So we've talked about adverse childhood experiences through TLC, Turning Points, but now it's going to be, you talked about, Judge, childhood poverty. We also have to keep on our plate adverse childhood experiences. And when we develop the budget, we're going to have to break from the norm, because our clientele need that adjustment in how we expend our funds.
An educated electorate. And I believe in an educated electorate, but also educated elected officials. And so I'd like to encourage our state and local reps to come to some of these meetings as well to hear this. I think that when we look at the poor, we paint a pretty broad brush. And as we talk about building walls and cutting programs such as TLC, Turning Points, those programs that help these people, help them get back on their feet, as Jack talked about. Their very futures are in jeopardy by our elected officials. I think that Middleton and I have talked about this, about our role in educating the public as they vote, what the implications of their vote means as far as us as a community, and how it directs us, how it directly affects us. So I think I would like to see some of our elected officials come who paint with that broad brush and see TLC, see Turning Points as entitlement programs, where they're more than that. And I think there's a difference between enabling and supporting.
Right now at 5, a shocking discovery in Greenfield. A pregnant mother found in the throes of a drug overdose. That woman also had 2 young children in her car.
Now she is charged with child neglect. Casey Geraldo is live with the latest. Casey. That's right, George and Carol. This is the Speedway gas station where the woman told police she came to get a drink with her kids, but that's when people noticed she was acting strange.
It looks like she is on something. Her eyes are rolling in the head. She keeps falling.
Yeah, apparently she's pretty messed up.
Customers inside this gas station suspected what Natalie Yazinski would later tell police.
She did admit to us that she used the heroin about an hour before she went to the store.
The police report says Yazinski and her kids were inside the store for about 45 minutes before one caller saw her get into her car.
She's getting ready to pull off.
With her 3- and 5-year-old children in the car, what police didn't know would be even more shocking.
We did not know that she was pregnant, but it was reported that there were 2 kids in the vehicle that she had walked back to.
Police got to the scene, arrested Yazinski for child neglect, then sent her in an ambulance to the hospital where she was treated with Narcan for an overdose. Lindstrom says the kids were released to their father, who was at work at the time. The family has been referred to the Bureau of Child Welfare. At 6, Lindstrom says it's not unusual at all for children to be at the scene of an overdose, but this case was different, and he feels it shows the bigger issue going on here. Live in Greenfield, Casey Geraldo, today's TMJ4.
Yeah, very serious and very sad. Casey, thank you very much.
Well, the Milwaukee County Medical Examiner sent out this tweet today. Based on January numbers, Milwaukee County is on track to log 444 drug ODs in 2017.
I think you need to hear from the people that are in it. I think you need to hear from someone like myself who lives it, so that when you're looking at barriers and all of these things, you can understand that because I'm a grandmother and I have to have some state aid to help me for financial reasons, I'm only allotted $16 for food stamps. Not even worth applying for. But that's a state level. But that's where, as a community or as whatever, we could go out there and say, this is not acceptable because that person needs that help. Why are they being banned? Because they're not the actual parent. And that's just, it's 50 years worth of being governed by, the health and welfare being governed by a program created 50 years ago that needs to be revisited. It needs to be revamped.
Today I want to talk about poverty. Is poverty a result of bad life choices, bad luck, a combination of both? I finally finished this book about hillbillies by J.D. Vance. It reminded me of my grandfather, who grew up dirt poor in Appalachia, born in southeast Kentucky, unbelievably poor. He witnessed violence, drug and alcohol abuse, bad relationship choices, just like in this book. Also, likewise, both men were able to escape poverty. My grandfather became middle class, and he's doing pretty dang well for himself. But can everyone escape poverty, or were they just the lucky ones? First, let me acknowledge that poor people are at a disadvantage. I don't want this video to come off as, why don't they stop being poor? Gross. Ugh. Parents play a big role. If you have parents who read to you, help you with your homework, take you to baseball practice, you're at a huge advantage compared to somebody whose parents are absent, always high or drunk, in and out of jail. These kids don't have the same support, don't have proper role models, aren't getting any kind of education at home. That said, there are things that people can do to improve their situation. 3 great pieces of advice. At least finish high school, get a full-time job, wait until you're at least 21 to get married, and then have kids. Of course, this is the internet, so I expect a bunch of, that's stupid advice, I got married at 19 and I'm fine. That's stupid advice, I did all that and I'm still broke. Okay, nothing is guaranteed and there will always be exceptions. The Brookings Institute found that of adult Americans who followed these rules, only 2% are in poverty and nearly 75% join the middle class. These stats show that life choices absolutely do matter. High school graduation rates have increased to 83.5%, but for Hispanics it's 77.8%, and for Black students it's 74.6%. Children born out of wedlock is at record highs. 40% of American children, 50% of Hispanic children, and 70% of Black children are born out of wedlock in this country, and that is a very bad thing. Children raised by single mothers are 4 times more likely to live in poverty and need government assistance. Once again, there are challenges and struggles that exist for poor people. Everything is harder if you have an unstable home life. But there are people escaping poverty, and they are doing so mostly by avoiding bad life choices. Yes, luck sometimes plays a role, but I'd say life choices plays the biggest role. Yet, when people like me say this, we're accused of being racist, victim blaming, too privileged to understand. This is unfortunate because this is something that young poor people need to hear. Nothing is guaranteed. There's going to be struggles along the way, but if you follow these 3 pieces of advice, you stand the best chance of escaping poverty. At least graduate high school, get a full-time job, wait until you're at least 21 to get married, and then have kids. And heroin, not even once.
So we don't have a way to capture all of those folks who are living paycheck to paycheck. We recently, in our payroll system, because of an error, some sort of technical glitch on the bank side, the direct deposit was delayed a few hours. Not a day, not a week, a few hours, and that had a detrimental impact on some of our employees. And so when we have folks living that tightly, yep, they're still, they don't need state assistance, they're still okay, they're still doing it on their own. They are within a few hours of a catastrophic event. That's a whole nother layer of folks that aren't reported in the numbers that I had tonight.
When we talk about poverty, keep in mind there are many folks, if not most, are working poor. When Walmart patted itself on the back for paying $10 an hour, I have people who come into my court on a regular basis with both parties working, making $10 an hour, absolutely incapable of paying $1,400 a month rent for a 2-bedroom apartment that no one in this room would live in. So these are not people who are lazy and don't want to work. There are lots of working poor who really do want to break that cycle, but you can't do it on $10 an hour, but you might be able to if early on you have assistance so you're not having to go to school meetings because your children aren't behaving and you're worrying about having to go take your children to counseling and all the other things that go along with poverty.
If you've been hunting for a house or apartment to rent, you already know how much prices have jumped. In fact, rental prices are at all-time highs across the country and incomes aren't keeping up. Some are calling it the worst rental affordability crisis in U.S. history. Personal finance journalist Vera Gibbons, a Zillow contributor, is here with more. Vera, good morning.
Good morning.
So what's going on?
Supply and demand. I mean, demand is ridiculous, and that's been the case ever since the housing collapse in 2007. People lost their homes to foreclosures. They were forced to actually get into their rental units. And supply is down. Construction was stalled because builders couldn't actually get the loans they needed to build. So if you look at what happened between 2007 and 2013, millions of Americans moved into rental units, and very few bought during that time period.
It's interesting also because it seems like it's a particular section. Like it looks like it's 20-somethings that just don't want to buy anymore.
That's part of the problem too. That's really the incremental demand that is pushing those prices higher. Some of these millennials, as the economy improves, Anthony, they're moving out of their homes, their parents' homes, and they're moving into the rental units. They're not in a position to buy. They can't have the down payment. They've got the student loan debt. They've got credit card debt. So that is pushing the prices even higher in a lot of different markets.
So, I mean, is this trend going to continue, do we think? Is there any relief in sight?
Unfortunately, no. I mean, the builders are building.
Right.
There are apartment complexes going up. But it takes time, it takes money, you've got to get the permits, you've got to get approvals. So it does take a while, and demand is expected to outpace supply for the foreseeable future. So rents, unfortunately, are expected to continue to go up. It's a good time to be a landlord, bad time to be a renter.
What should we be paying for rent? Is there a rule of thumb for people to calculate?
Yes, I mean, in order for your rent and your utilities to be affordable, it's not supposed to exceed 30% of your household. And yeah,
welcome to New York.
I'm like doing the math there.
New York is absolutely ridiculous. But Zillow actually did analysis for the New York Times recently and found that in 90 cities, the median rent, not including utilities, is greater than the median gross income. So this is really problematic. 50% of renters, according to a Harvard study, are now spending more than 30% of their income on rent. And as you mentioned, New York. I mean, New York, San Francisco. Some of these
Boston, I
cities,
was surprised, is at the top of this list.
Boston's at the top of the list, too. I mean, some of these markets are higher than others because the jobs, the convenience factors. I mean, there's a lot of different reasons why people are flocking to these cities. And the demand is just outrageous. Again, it's supply and demand.
Is buying a home still considerably cheaper than renting?
It is still. I mean, affordability is on the wane, as you know, but it is still cheaper. In fact, the analysis actually shows it's 38% cheaper to buy a home in the 100 largest metro markets. Now, that gap has been narrowing because affordability is on the wane, mortgage rates are rising. Last year, it was 44% cheaper to buy a home. But in most markets, still, it is still cheaper and more affordable to buy a home. But again, you have to come up with a down payment. You have to have good credit. There's a lot of hurdles.
No, but it's good for people to remember because we keep hearing about mortgage rules tightening. So it's a good reminder to people it's still cheaper to buy.
Keep your credit up.
Yeah, Vera Gibbons, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Melanie, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I wanted to say that I think we can change. I think that there is hope, and sometimes, like you were saying, Michelle, just having one person believe in you, you know, that we are seeing generations of, you know, poverty or trauma, and somebody from our agency, you could meet the other staff too, they go in and they connect with people. And so it is about the kids, but it starts with the parents. And if we can connect with the parents and help them to see how important their role is and how important it is to have stable housing, how important it is to read to them every day, how important it is to have, you know, the formula that they need, and to help them figure out how to make those things happen and have those things available, and to have that attachment with their child that fuels them to keep going and to make sure they have formula and to make sure that they can pay the rent, because that's where it comes from. Like, we could help and give supports, which we should do, concrete support sometimes, but really what fuels maintaining that is the attachment, and that's what we're focused on. And if we could get in to every home and talk about attachment and how important that is in the first 3-5 years, that would be amazing, you know, because
Councilor Dameron?
Yeah, I'd like to
have you add one component, one leg to the start of your plan that you're putting together, and that's the issue of sustainability.
Yep, okay.
I remember vividly in the late 1990s, I started in the district in 1995. I remember very vividly discussing some of the statistics that Corey was talking about. They aren't new. I don't remember discussing poverty, but I remember discussing a whole bunch of the other statistics and programs such as Parents as Teachers, Schools of the 21st Century. At the middle school, there was a program sponsored by a teacher dealing with children of incarcerated parents, and on we go. Over time, those programs went away because no one had really talked about and put into concrete terms, fine, after the grant runs out or after the initial funding from Joe Blow expires, how in the heck do we sustain it? And the sustainability piece is what caused everything to drop off the plate at the end.
And measuring success.
Measuring success, you're going to pick exemplars, programs that are successful, that are proven. Just add sustainability in with that. We talked many times about the fact that we are going to be so successful with Parents as Teachers that it's going to grow and the school will never cut it. And that was wrong, because the school over time did cut it. It ended up being budget concerns, so on and so forth. It's not only the city council that goes back and debates budgets. Believe me, after 17 years, I know darn well the school board does that as well. And that's part of your job. That's part of what you should be doing. But then these little programs get chipped away at. And so just add sustainability to the list.
Will do. Councillor Pope?
So far I'm hearing that it's important to have stable housing, important to be able to pay the rent, attachment to both families and relatives. 50% of our fifth graders didn't start with us and are now with us. We have working poor. And I think there's a man in here that, well, City Manager McNutt, I think he's dealt with a lot of housing issues in the past, and I wouldn't put him on the spot tonight. But maybe looking at some of these things that I know you've worked with, like workforce housing, housing for the working poor, not talking 100% subsidized, but things like that. I know that that's been one of your strengths in the past, and at some point, look at some things like this and give us a good report. I would rely on your experience and expertise in that. Look forward to hearing about it.